Welcome to Voices in Social Work, a Carleton School of Social Work podcast. We discuss important topics in the field of social work and give you the tools to start some new conversations with those around you. We acknowledge that Carleton is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation and are exploring ways to support Indigenous communities who have suffered in order for us to be here and do what we do. Let's get started. Hi, and welcome back to Voices in Social Work. Before the episode is introduced, I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that this episode is being released during a time where there has been a lot of violence, death, and displacement due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I also wanted to note that there are many other areas of the world with armed conflicts and crisis situations. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, or ACLED, highlights Ethiopia, Yemen, the Sahel region of Africa, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Sudan, Haiti, Colombia, and Myanmar as areas of conflict that are likely to worsen in 2022. I have a lot more to learn about what is happening in these areas, but I'll just say that my thoughts and prayers go out to everybody in situations that I can't even imagine. One suggestion I have is that if you are looking to donate to any humanitarian efforts, consult charity evaluation sites such as Charity Intelligence Canada to ensure that your money will be used well. Thank you, and we'll now move on to the podcast episode. Hi everyone, this is episode 5 of Voices in Social Work. Today, my guest Namrata and I will discuss the idea of community or collective care and compare it to the idea of self-care that is promoted in our society. Namrata also shares some advice for people looking to build more of a community around themselves. Just a quick note that we ran into some microphone issues during our recording, and as a result, I had to lower the volume of the entire episode in order to balance the audio levels. You may need to turn up your volume when the conversation starts. Don't worry, I also lowered the volume of the outro music so that it won't hurt your ears when you get to the end. Thanks and enjoy. So, thank you for being here and for being willing to talk about community care with me and to let other people listen as well.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
So, as we said before, the topic of this podcast is going to be community care versus self-care, or kind of comparing the two. It's also called collective care. That will probably get you some more research, more stuff will come up. Before we start that, I just want to give you, Namrata, a chance to introduce yourself. Can you just give a short intro about yourself and your work, anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Namrata. My pronouns are they and she, and I'm a racialized settler, right now residing on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And I say that while acknowledging the illegalities of my presence under settler colonialism. So I was born and raised on Treaty 23 territory, and I spent a lot of time in community and growing on Treaty 3 territory. So that's a little bit about place. But to give an intro to myself, I'm a community organizer and I'm an artist. So specifically, I'm a poet and a performance poet. I love the stage and I love audiences. And some of my past work in the community has included resistance to fossil fuel expansion, especially within the context of institutions, as well as advocacy around accessible education, anti-racism work, and more recently, beginning to explore abolitionist and queer futures, both within the context of police and prison abolition. So, as someone who is queer, racialized, first generation immigrant, and more femme presenting, I feel that the identities that I hold has really helped and really shaped the way that I move through the world, but also what community means to me, which is why I'm so excited about this topic. And also, I'm a recent graduate, I guess a 2021 graduate from the MSW program at Carleton, which has also shaped my experiences as well.
I forgot to mention that, yeah, because we were in the same class and kind of graduated together, although our last couple semesters were online.
Yeah, absolutely.
To start off with, the first question I wanted to ask is what does community care or collective care mean to you? I didn't find a lot of academic research. I found a lot of more recent articles, just when I was looking things up, like just online articles on Google, blog posts, that kind of thing, that were referencing maybe different more recent posts that went viral on social media, maybe about a year ago, talking about community care. But of course, we know that this isn't the first time this idea has come up. The idea of community care, or what they called intercommunalism, was referenced by the Black Panther Party in the 1970s. And it really shaped their beliefs and the work that they did. I think the idea of community care and collective care has been a very unspoken truth, or kind of so basic that it's unspoken in a lot of collectivist cultures. So we're not necessarily introducing a new idea. We're responding to ideas that are already out there and adding our own experiences, and maybe some people can relate. So that being said, community care is, there's a lot of different definitions that I found online, and there wasn't really any sort of agreed upon definition, but it basically, community care is kind of defined as taking care of each other and believing that we're not just here to look out for ourselves. And that's can contrast the idea of self-care, which in our society has it's kind of based on the assumption that we are completely independent and we need to put all this time into ourselves because nobody else is going to do it for us. So I don't know if you wanted to build on that.
Yeah, I can definitely build on that. I really appreciate that you mentioned the Black Panther Party because that was also something that I looked at in my research, and I think that they are a really great example of community care in the work that they have done. And I think also kind of in my own experiences about learning about community care, I think it's so important what you're saying about this not being a new concept, because I think there are so many people before us who have talked about it. Um, and I can mention some people who've inspired me, and who I definitely carry with me. So definitely, I would say the work of like Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, um, as well as Sarah Taylor as well has a really good blog on this, Angela Davis. So those are some of the Black feminists that I look to when I think about community care. But then also, I think a lot of the people that taught me about it were people in community. So like Black, Indigenous, and racialized women and femmes. Like those are the people that I learned from. And I think when you when you mention that, a quote that comes to mind, and it's like one of my favorite quotes, is like Bell Hooks says that like one of the most vital ways we sustain ourselves is by building communities of resistance, places where we know we are not alone. And I feel like that quote just ties into like so much of what you also said, is like in collectivist cultures and in this community care, it's like this idea of interdependence and like knowing that we're not alone in it. So, mhm.
I know you said you're a poet, so I was just wondering, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But maybe could you provide maybe some language to what community care might feel like to you, or describe the experience of it in your other senses as well?
Wow, this is a really interesting question. Yeah, that's I have to take a minute to think about it. Um, I feel like community care can feel tender. It can feel like you are being witnessed and heard. Um, I think it can be revolutionary. and um, and it feels very nourishing. I think if I were to describe it in my body, it's almost like it's nourishing, and it feels like it's really hopeful. So, yeah.
Could you describe a little bit about how you were first introduced to the idea of community care and how your understanding of it has grown?
Yeah. So I think I was first introduced to it like within the context of like the student movement. There was like a lot of like conferences and just like talks that I went to about self-care and community care. So in addition to like all of the Black feminists that I've mentioned, it was also in those spaces. But then it was really about seeing those concepts and practicing them. So I can give examples. So like for example, mutual aid, right? It's like something that is talked about a lot, but it's like the idea that we keep ourselves safe and that we take care of each other. So because I'm also a community organizer, I saw this like in practice. It's like, if people needed funds for their rent or other things, or they're having a crisis, it's like showing up for each other in those times is like um, is kind of like how I got introduced to it. So the idea of mutual aid and being in solidarity with someone, and then I think it is also just when people have showed up and cared for me. And I think that's really big. Like the interpersonal part of it is really big. So like people accompanying me to like doctor's appointments, or my neighbors and I cooking each other meals in the pandemic, and like holding space for each other as we navigate systems of oppression. Like that happened in grad school too. Like there was a community of people holding me, and I think that really supported me like through the program. And so I hope I answered your question, but I think it really taught me how to show up for people, and what that meant beyond just like words. Like it actually means like actions, and showing up and putting knowing that you can take care of yourself, but there's a whole world beyond that. And just like another example, I live on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, and the last 4 weeks have been such a big example of community care. People have been walking each other to places to ensure they're safe. People have been dropping off groceries for each other. There's been like a whole lawsuit that's happened, but that all came from the community.
Can you
Um,
just give a little context just in case somebody's listening to this in the future?
Yeah, sure. So we're in the third week of February, and so there's been a siege that has been happening in Ottawa, and has been linked to like far right extremist groups and like white supremacists. And so there's a lot of BIPOC people in the city who have been feeling really unsafe. Um, and there's been a lot of like increased police presence as well. So um, really when that started to happen, we we saw, like, I think within like a day or two, I started to see things pop up, like local groups started to organize things. Suddenly, like like local businesses were also like making sure that they amplified other businesses that were right in the middle of the convoy. And so it was really incredible, and it's like the people power, right? And it was really nice to see that. So I think the last thing in like kind of my definition of community care is that it involves justice. I think like actually talking about systems of oppression and how these things harm us, because I think if we only talk about the mutual aid without talking about structures, we can get really lost in just the micro. Um, but for me, it's also showing up in the streets, right, and protesting. And that might not be everybody's way, but yeah.
So I guess you mean that a lot of times the need for community care is because of systemic oppression or other systemic issues. And so part of showing up for people is trying to change those things for the long term, right?
Actually, yeah, absolutely.
I know you and I kind of talked a little bit about this beforehand about the idea of community care versus self-care, and I wanted to kind of have a little bit of a comparison of that during this discussion because in social work, we talk a lot about the idea of self-care and making sure that you take time for yourself because of how stressful the position can be for many different reasons. Can you talk about like your understanding of self-care and well and how that's maybe evolved? And if there was a time when you kind of started to question the value of self-care or what was being told to you about that?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I do think that uh, there have been instances, even like when I've been reading about it, that self care can be really radical. And I know I referenced like Audre Lorde and Sarah Taylor in this, but I think what made me question self care, especially like capitalistic self care, um, is having to work in environments that, were racist, but also getting through like work environments and grad school and kind of being told that I could self care my way out of microaggressions, right? And out of experiences of harm. And so, like, even for me, as someone who's studying social work, therapy even tells us, or therapeutic practice can tell us to like lean into exploring, these feelings of belonging and why we don't belong. But then if you haven't seen yourself reflected and uplifted and affirmed, it can be really hard to fit into spaces, right? Especially if those spaces are white or you don't feel like you belong there. So I think um, I started off thinking about self care in this very capitalistic way. And um, I think the thing that kind of made me think about it more is that the blame I feel is sometimes put on the individual for not self caring hard enough, right? But then I think the thing that really changed my viewpoint is like in addition to like all the literature that I've mentioned is an understanding of systems of oppression because that blame doesn't get put on yourself. um, so I could tell myself like, okay, I've done individual reflection, I've done journaling, I've done grounding, but I am seeking out an individual solution to a systemic issue by trying to only have self-care. And so I think what I needed in that moment was community and people to affirm me. So
Again, one of the various like very short articles that I found online that were referencing the idea of community care or collective care. And one is from a couple years ago from the University of Alberta, and it talks about how if the environment around you is an unhealthy environment or it's hurting you or making you question yourself, then self-care is not necessarily going to fix that. It doesn't change your situation that you're in. You're still going out into the world and facing the same environment that's making you feel that way. So why should you expect doing all this individual work to make that better when that's not the source of the problem?
absolutely, yeah.
And the article also mentioned the idea that self-care has become very commodified, or people have used it to make a lot of money because it's framed as something that you need to purchase or that you need to buy. And then it becomes, like you said, where it's like, oh, you're not doing enough, you're not putting enough time, you're not putting enough money into this, and that's why you continue to feel bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because if I can add something to that, Monica, um, is that the like when Audre Lorde wrote about this in her like 19, yes, I have it quoted here, but like a 1988 essay, so it's called A Burst of Light and Other Essays. she has this quote, and it's quoted often, and I'm sure you've heard it, um, where she says that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And she often says this, where self-care can be a really radical act to protect yourself against systems and to preserve your energy and to go forward. But I think sometimes, especially in the pandemic, those things have been lost, I think. And as you said, there's a whole industry that is intent on seeing how we can self-care better and who has access to that. And so that also gets into like class lines of like socioeconomic status in class, because who can access the really nice spa day or the weekend getaway or anything else, right? And so I think the initial, at least from what I've read and what's influenced me, the initial um aspect of it was to actually protect your energy and be able to, what, like, when confronting systems. But I think it's been like Western notions of it have really made it into a commodity. So if that makes sense.
I guess there's a difference between protecting your energy and ignoring systems or pretending that oppressive systems don't exist. Maybe the other side, the way it originally was something like acknowledging they exist, but oh, I need this time and I also need to support other people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so I feel like the definition was interdependent in and of itself before, if that makes sense. So
Maybe our society has kind of twisted or cut off pieces of that original definition to maybe
mhm,
allow businesses to sell products or
mhm,
to kind of fit the culture that we're in Canada. You were talking about the idea of community care being revolutionary or an act of resistance. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that idea, maybe for someone who's never heard of this concept before, even for people that don't know that much about social work,
mhm,
or haven't really thought too much about systems and society. What's being resisted? Why is it needed? And how it works.
mhm. Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think one of the things that is being resisted is the myth that we have to do it all alone. And there's this myth that if we seek help, we are somehow less than or less than capable. When in reality, as I think I've mentioned, like, I'm from a collectivist culture, like I grew up in a collectivist culture, and um I still feel very rooted in that. And so we aren't meant to do things um alone. And so I do see that as like one of the forms of resistance, is like resisting that myth. Um, but then also, one of the papers I actually wrote during wrote during grad school is about the ways in which neoliberalism is impacting our ability to create relationships with each other and intentional relationships. So it's resisting this culture of urgency and the culture of, as I mentioned, needing to do it alone. But it's doing that by slowing down and connecting with people and showing up for people and asking them um, what they need. So I think at the crux of it, it's resisting that we're only supposed to look out for ourselves and that we can only focus on our own growth to succeed. Because that was definitely something that I feel was taught to me either by the media or school, is that, you know, you gotta focus on yourself, and if you do that, you'll be able to succeed. But um it was really interesting because I remember sitting there being like, oh, but I actually am doing this for so many people around me. Like, I'm doing this. I've untied some of that now, but like, I'm doing this for other people, and I want to also see my family, be happy and stable. And being a first generation immigrant, there's a lot of pressure there too, right? So um, I think there's some resisting Western notions of individualism and making it alone.
Kind of resisting the ideas that if you need help, that there's something wrong with you. And then also the idea that the kind of ultimate goal in life is to make a lot of money or have a really successful, quote unquote, successful career, which I guess would be mostly defined by money.
Mm-hmm.
Because those ideas can really hurt people that don't have the resources to be able to achieve them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it can really hurt communities to say that we need to do it alone. I think we can be really disconnected and and saying that there is, something wrong with you if you're seeking help. That's so hard because vulnerability, I think, is important. And I know you've talked about Brene Brown's work in other podcasts. It requires vulnerability to say, we're not alone. We don't need to do this alone. And so, mhm. And courage, I
Okay.
think. And courage. Sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt.
courage to kind of look around at all of the subtle cues that you're getting from society and say, no, I actually don't agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Hmm. What are kind of the main similarities and differences for you when you think about community care versus your self-care?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for it. So I think in terms of similarities, I think both of them have the ability to be healing and transformative. Um, and I'm not including capitalistic self-care in that. Um, but um, I do think that they both have healing powers and transformative powers for sure. Um, I think the differences are really self-care to me, at least, is like taking care of my own mental health, healing through past experiences, standing up for my own needs, like things that aren't necessarily things that wouldn't be looked upon as like very savvy and like Instagrammable, right? Like, oh, I stood up for my needs today at work, like, and and doing difficult things that your future self will thank you for. So yeah, and I think it's really, my definition has really grown and evolved over time and being in community. And then I think community care can kind of go beyond that for me. So just like I think it still allows people to take care of themselves, but, and it's not saying that don't take care of yourself, but it's also saying sometimes it's not enough because um, we're still dealing with all of these structural things. And so I think it's extending care to others, showing up for others, building community, redistributing wealth, being in solidarity, whether that's solidarity along gender lines or um, socioeconomic lines. Um, yeah, and so I think both of them have the ability to be liberating, but there's just some differences um, amongst them. So yeah.
I know sometimes for me, like I need to take some time and resources to
Mm-hmm.
process by myself. If
Mm-hmm.
I'm going through something, to be able to process what's happened. And
Mm-hmm.
then after I do that, a lot of times I'm more able to engage with community as well, or talk to other
Mm-hmm.
people who are going through the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of need both. That's
Mm-hmm.
maybe my personality too, that I would do those
Mm-hmm.
things in that order. Some people might reverse it, but I know for me, having both is important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think it's so valuable to know that you need to pour into yourself in order to also show up for community in the ways that you want to engage with and like how you want to engage. I think that's so important. Yeah.
Have that
And
because community is like the give and take, right? So
like,
um, you can do some work on your own to be able to participate in community.
mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, I know you had asked about what community care provides that self-care doesn't. And I think it goes beyond like a therapy room or my journaling practice, right? It really, I think it reassures me in a different way, um, that I'm not alone in this and that it's okay to need people and it's okay to be dependent on people. Um, yeah, especially I think as someone who um, has, you know, not only in a collectivist culture, but with the first generation immigrant piece, perfectionism is really, really strong. And I'm definitely recovering, but I think it provides reassurance, and like community care for me provides like that reassurance and love and support. Because even though I can give that to myself, I think it feels different coming from community. Um, yeah.
Yes, I mean, we're built to need people, and sometimes we need people to tell us things when we're still working on believing them ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And like and just like also growing up, I think it was a very like collectivist um way of being. And so um I think it's really returning to that, if that makes sense. It's almost returning to like the ways in which we took care of each other uh when I was younger, and kind of, you know, going through university and then suddenly not wanting to be collectivist and wanting to be individualistic and succeed. And I think we go through phases, and so that happened. And then I think now, as I reflect back on it, with all of this community, not only like being in community, but as I come back to myself more and I'm more authentic with myself, I'm able to recognize how important that collectivist culture was for me. So, mm-hmm,
That's nice.
mm-hmm,
Okay, so we're going to take a quick break and then come back and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the maybe the application piece, how we can kind of try to build community around us or why that can be difficult too. So, okay, so welcome back for all of the listeners. Probably wasn't that long, but we're going to move into the second half, maybe the last third of the podcast. I think our first section went on a little bit long. Like I mentioned before, the second half is going to be focused a little bit on application, maybe some advice about how people can kind of start to build their own communities or recognize the communities around them, to be
mm-hmm,
able to care for each other. Because I know a lot of times there is like that, especially I think for people that are social workers or who are aspiring social workers who are studying to become social workers, there is a need for community, especially
mm-hmm,
when you're dealing with difficult situations and maybe even seeing things that you've never seen before. What are some of the things that can stop you from seeking community care, or what have been some of the obstacles that you needed to work around in order to
mm-hmm,
kind of see a community around yourself or to build a community around yourself?
mm-hmm. That's a great question. So one of them is something that I've already mentioned before. So it's that, and I think it's been mentioned a couple of times throughout, which is great. Like the myth of doing it alone. So I think we've talked about that, so I won't explain it too much unless it's needed. But I think the other thing is it's quite a personal one, but it's actually being able and opening yourself up to receive support. That is, that can be really, really scary, for people who, you know, are used to doing things alone. But I think there's also and maybe it's just my own experience, but I think there is this notion, as social workers, or people who studied social work, it's like we need to be able to do all these things and cope with all the things, and we support others, but we don't need support. And so I think really troubling that myth, and saying, like, the people who support others also need support, even if it's not necessarily normalized. So that's definitely something. So it's definitely like an internal thing to work through, to actually need support, recognize it, and then ask for it. And so I would say that's definitely been an obstacle that I have had to work through myself. Um, and then I also think there is something to be said about people's positionality, and like, for me, as being like along like racial and gendered lines, there's also something, um i think I think it's like a societal pressure because of the power structures that we have, that like racialized people and more femme presenting people and women have to be strong and take care of everyone, but not necessarily be taken care of. And so I think I had to unlearn that on a cultural level, and also on a professional level, and also on a personal level, and yeah. And so I think those are some of the things that have stopped me. Mhm.
Do you have any maybe advice, or can you share a little bit about um, what you did to kind of work around those or to overcome those mental blocks or beliefs?
Mhm. Yeah, I think one of them, and I don't know if we talk about it enough in the field, is actually accessing support for myself, whether that is actually going to therapy and talking about the fact that it is hard for me to access support. So that's, I would say, one thing that can actually be really valuable, because I do think we talk a lot about providing other people with mental health support, but what does that look like for yourself? And I think it's so important to ask those questions. But I think the second thing, is having people that I trust, um, that I know, um, that I either know for a while, or just people that I have a sense of trust and community with, and being able to start really small and ask them for something. And it's like a really low stakes thing. Like, hey, could you, I'm doing a performance tomorrow. Would you like to come? Like, just something like, I would like to feel supported by a friend, and asking those things, or being like, hey, um I have a deadline coming up for something and I'm really nervous. Do you think you would like to read over what I've written? Um and starting with things, where I knew that I would be disappointed if it didn't happen, but it was like a lower stakes thing. And then relying, knowing as time went on, I built that with people. And then I was able to ask for maybe bigger things, or things that felt like I need to do this by myself, but being able to reach out and say, hey, I'm in a situation where I feel vulnerable, but I actually do need help. And then I think also there's something to be said about vulnerability, because it requires me admitting that I need the help, and um reconciling that within myself, and actually opening myself up to it, whether that's the person does the thing or I'm disappointed, but opening myself up. And that takes a risk, and it can be very scary when you're not used to it. So I think just being able to sit with yourself and say, like, okay, I know both of the outcomes and I'm okay with it, and I'm building something here and it's important. And so it's almost like exercising a muscle. Yeah.
I like that idea of starting with small steps, but then also recognizing that when you take the big step, it's still going to be hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think that advice would change like in a work capacity? So maybe for people that are social workers that kind of don't feel like they have a community around them to support them in their work, would
Mm-hmm.
you have any advice or would it be different? Because it's a bit of a different setting versus like personal. I don't know if you'd have any advice.
Yeah. Do you mean like building community at work, essentially?
Yeah.
Is that what you're okay?
Or sometimes when you deal with work problems, right? Then
Mm-hmm.
or having people like help you understand or process
Mm-hmm.
when something happens and it kind of shakes you a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would say, and I'm still working through this myself, so I'm constantly learning, and I just want to acknowledge that. But I would say like find people that you can trust, even if it's one person. If there's one coworker that you have that you feel is able to hold space for you. And when you walk away from those interactions, you're feeling validated and heard and supported. I think that's so important. And so I think over time it can be hard when you don't have when you haven't started that, or you might be working in an environment where you maybe there can be some interpersonal dynamics that make it hard. And so that's definitely a reality for sure. But if it is possible, I think starting with even seeing whose interactions make you feel validated and supported, and that you can trust them. And then I think if they're going through something and they come to you, if you have capacity, being open to receiving that, because then they also build trust with you, and then you also going to them to kind of ask, I need something. Is it possible for me to ask for this? And so um when difficult things happen, like especially in the workplace, and you need people to process with, I think if you build relationships and connections with people, even if you haven't gone to them with anything before, but you start to build that relationship and that connection with people, um, in times of crisis, or in times of turmoil, or in times where it feels really difficult, it can be a lot easier to then ask, because you already have that connection with that person and you have that relationship. And then what you're doing essentially is opening a doorway to be like, we can mutually support each other, or I might just need support, if that makes sense.
Like a lot of people are willing to help once you kind of have even a very small or brief connection, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you can use that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any final advice for people that are maybe feeling isolated or feel like they don't have a community or that kind of thing? Or if you want to jump in with any other stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So I'd be happy to answer that question. And then I don't know, maybe just I would definitely also love to reference this blog post that I've been referencing, and like some work that I think is important, because it goes so much, it goes beyond me for sure. Like this idea is so rooted, and I think it's so important. I'm so glad we had this conversation. So, um, yeah, I think in terms of people who are either struggling to ask for help, or who want a community around them, or figuring out where to start, I think a couple of things. So, of course, the validation is really important. So, I would say the first thing is that it's okay to be afraid, or hesitant, or uncomfortable when you first start to think about asking for support, or leaning on people, or being leaned on, even, right? And I feel like so many feelings can come up. Those are just some of them that I listed. But even feeling guilt, like, oh my gosh, I have to ask for help. Like, what does this mean about me? Am I a burden? Like those things are very natural thoughts, and it's okay to think them. But I think when you're having when you're in this process of finding community, I think it's important to be compassionate with yourself and remind yourself that needing other people is natural and it's a human thing. So there's nothing wrong with you. But I think that mm, the our reactions to ourselves are also so important as we go on this journey. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's what I would suggest just from my perspective. But also, I think sometimes it can be helpful to build community by like reaching out to people around you. I know Zoom school is a thing, like people are always on Zoom, but like going to virtual events and even like connecting with someone after. I've definitely met like poets that way in the pandemic. But also like if there's something that you're interested in, let's say it's like a cause that you care about, around maybe justice or organizing, or even if it's something unrelated to those things, like see what's happening in your community and don't be afraid to get involved. It could be going to a meeting, it could also just be going to like a crochet club, there's so many different ways um to build that connection. Yeah. So mhm.
Great advice. Thanks.
Mhm.
You said you wanted to add some other stuff too?
Yeah, so I would just like to say that like a lot of the like if people want to, have other starting places to look at more of community care, people who talk about like liberation work in community care, I think the three people I've like or four people that I've mentioned throughout, so like the work of Bell Hooks does a lot on love and liberation and care. Audre Lorde, who has written a lot about self care as active political warfare. Angela Davis, of course. I don't feel like she needs an introduction, and also Sarah Taylor, who has this it's a literary blog, and it's called Dissolving Margins, and so she writes she curates all these like really lovely articles, but one of them was actually about Audre Lorde and self-care and Black radical activism, and I thought it was so neat, and she talks a lot about some of the things that we've mentioned today, so I think that blog is really good, so feel free to check it out.
Is there anything else you'd like to say, or is that good?
No, I think that's great. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to Voices in Social Work. We hope you now have something new to talk about or explore. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at sswpodcast@carleton.ca. You can also visit voicesinsocialwork.podbean.com to see our full list of episodes and links to all of the ways you can listen to us. See you next time.